Alrighty, back yet again with some of these Fossil Creek classes. Like usual, my name is Jackson, the retail manager over here at Fossil Creek Nursery, and today we are talking all about planting to plants. Now, I'm going to be a little bit more specific about fall planting in this class, but I just kind of want to talk about planting overall because in the Front Range of Colorado, in this part of the country, there are a lot of conditions that are actually going to be really nice and really helpful for planting. So what that is going to entail is a couple different things. Like usual, I'm going to try and split up the class into different sections as much as possible to kind of go over the most amount of information that I can in the time that we do have here. So initially, I'm going to talk a little bit about spacing and setup to get ready to plant in the fall, and then I'm going to delve into what you can, what you may not want to be planting in the fall, different options, go through that, and then finally care and preparation for winter. So let's kick things off with a little bit about preparing to plant. This is the planning part. This is by far, in my opinion, the least exciting stage of the whole thing. And that is only because we're not doing anything yet. We have to put a lot of effort into figuring out what we're going to put somewhere before we start doing it, or else you end up with 15 perennials when you only need 2 in one area. I know I can always get a little over ambitious during those times, so let's start talking about that. So you have a plot of land. Either it could be a small area that you just want to populate, or it's something larger. You have a bigger slot of land that you're looking to put something but you're not really sure of. Well, what can we plant this time of year? What are you hoping to do? What are the conditions? Those are irrigation set up. These are all questions we'll need to ask ourselves before we start putting things in the ground, before we start caring, before we start prepping for winter. So again, here in the Front Range, it's important to know that our soils are very, very alkaline, meaning that they're very high in pH. Very basic soils, and a lot of times that is because of the clay, the physical, the physics and the chemistry of our soil, the physical content, whether it be clay, silt, or sand, the 3 physical components that make up soil, or whether it be the lack of organic matter. Clay is very difficult to plant in. A lot of times it can be compacted, there's not a whole lot of oxygen around, and it just really is not great and conducive for a happy plant. However, there are things we can do to change that. Now, planning to plant is also important, not only because knowing the soil is good, but you also have to know the environment. I say that soils are clay and basic here because in general they are. However, if you're in a new development, soils can be even worse. If you are in a situation where there is not going to be a whole lot of protection, either from a house, from a fence, from other plants in a specific area, then that would also cause some issues to deal with as well. So, on top of picking a spot that you want to populate, you also want to think, okay, here's what the soil is like in this area. It's very clay, it's compacted, I can barely put a shovel into this. You also have to think about the conditions as far as how windy the area is, how much protection is going on there. It's also important to know the access to water, if you're going to be using a drip system, if you're going to be hand watering, because this time of year, planting, it's very important that you're making sure that your water is correct. And what do I mean by my water is correct? I mean that in these soils, because of that clay particle, which is extremely small, they combine very easily and they compact very easily. They can also hold water very easily. Number one thing that we see around here is overwatering for plants. So if you're putting something in the clay, you're not amending the soil at all, you really have to be careful about what type of water you're using, how much water you're using, and allowing things to dry out slightly in between waterings. Now, yes, you want to be able to keep a plant fairly consistently wet in order for it to get established. That does not mean always wet. It does not mean sopping wet. You want to be able to look down at that plant, water it once a week, and check on it every couple days. Are the leaves wilting? Are they browning? Is the soil wet? Stick a finger in the soil. Is it wet? Is it dry? If so, that will tell you a good amount of what you're going to need to do to take care of it. Everybody wants numbers. Everybody wants this many gallons in this amount of time. Please don't ask for that information. It is not going to help you. What's going to help you is going out there every couple days, once a week, and just checking on the plant. They're going to talk to you. They're going to tell you whether they're wilting. They're going to tell you whether they're overwatered, and you can check that too. If you take a picture to someone at the nursery, a CCMP, a nursery professional, or someone that's working at the register, or a manager, they're hopefully going to try and ask you a bunch of questions to decide. Generally, if it's a water or anything abiotic, if there's an issue there, meaning that it has nothing to do with insects or disease, just a picture is not going to be the most helpful thing. Information is going to be very helpful. How are you caring for this plant? How often are things happening? What have you seen? And those are all reasons why we have to kind of get through this before we can start talking about the plants and care for fall and winter, what to do, how to plant, everything like that. So, say that you have the ability to hand water, perfect. That's fantastic. Know that beforehand, and so you can get the correct amount of water, let it dry out before in between those waterings, and keep going. If you have a drip system, that's totally fine, but make sure that, again, you know your location, you know your soil, and then finally you know your intensity. 6 hours or more of light is going to be considered a full sun plant, meaning that it can take the heat, the arid conditions, it can take the soil just fine. Now, 6 or less hours of light, mostly in the morning, is going to be more your shade plants. The time of day is also extremely important. If you're getting all of your light in the morning, but then it dips off in the afternoon and is shaded, that is still a shady location. Light and heat is much dimmer and is less prevalent in the morning, and the plants respond accordingly. And then again, afternoon into the evening, if that's when you're getting all your heat and light, that means that you have more of a full sun xeric location. So, we have our location. We know how much space we have. We know what we're dealing with as far as soil. We know what we're dealing with as far as access to water. And we know what we're dealing with as far as light. A couple more things I want to mention before I start actually talking about the fun stuff here is that water, again, is super important. Whether you have an access to water through a hose or a drip, most people are going to be turning off their irrigation systems in October, which only makes sense. We have a higher chance for freezes, and we don't want to spend thousands of dollars trying to fix anything, so that's okay. But it's still important to know that perennials, trees, shrubs, even some of your fall plantings like chrysanthemums are going to need excess water, and they're going to need to be watered through the winter. If you are the type of person that, or not type of person, if you have, say, a rental or donor house or vacation house here, you're planting, it's gonna be difficult, especially if you go away for the winters, to make sure they have water. So again, access to water year-round is gonna be important. That's the first step of planning to plant, is knowing you have all these things, you know your space, you know your area. Alrighty. Good. We can move past all that now into the fun stuff. And the fun stuff for me is going to be what you can plant in the fall. Now, this is, again, the type of location where you can plant any time of year for certain things. So if we're talking about, we're still in the gardening mood, we're really wanting to get back into some of those cool season vegetables, some of those crops that can still be harvested well into the fall and winter, then you absolutely can. There are several vegetables and herbs that you can still plant right now and get a decent harvest out of. That's why when they're cool season crops, they're not specific about certain times of year, because both spring and fall, you can plant cool season crops and get a yield off it. It's just, again, the idea that it is cooler and more temperate during some times of years, and that's what those plants are going to want. Otherwise, if they're planted in the heat, they'll start to bolt or flower, which can drastically affect the taste and texture of whatever you're trying to grow. Now, coming up here is a great time of year to start more seeds for your cool season crops. Some examples are going to be leafy vegetables like your spinach. Some of them are going to be, again, leafy like your lettuce. Kale's another one. There are ornamental kales as well that would do good to be planted now. You could absolutely try to get maybe some more of your mustard-related crops like a broccoli in there as well, but depending on our very bipolar weather, you may or may not be able to have a long, successful crop. But the harvest and repeat crops, again, many of these leafy things, you can plant now. It's going to be cooler, and then you can get a couple harvests for our first frost. And also, a lot of these are going to be much more tolerant to freezes as well. So, vegetables are definitely an option. You just want to make sure they're cool season vegetables, and if you walk into any garden center, they should be able to direct you to their cool season vegetables so you can still continue to have that wonderful gardening habit that everybody loves so much. So that is going to be kind of it for some of your annuals and, well, specifically vegetables. Annuals are going to be another important one. A lot of people aren't done with flowers yet, and that's okay. We have pansies are going to come back in the season here. Again, ornamental kales. Things like vinca are also still going to be nice. We also, one of the best sellers around this time in the green industry are chrysanthemums. Chrysanthemums. Gotta love them. Now, chrysanthemum is a genus of plants in the aster family that is technically a perennial around here. However, if you buy them at the store, buy them at the garden center, a lot of times they won't be sold as such. And that is because chrysanthemums are grown to bloom one time of year. They are grown for the fall. And when they do grow these things, they will juice them full of fertilizer to get as much foliage and eventually as much blooms as physically possible. Because of this and the tender nature of their foliage and the amount of fertilizer they've been given, once you put them in a clay environment like our soils, they may or may not come back next year. I have seen them come back great. I have seen them die off completely. Regardless of what happens, even if it does come back, unless you're fertilizing extremely regularly, it's not going to be the same as when you initially purchased it. But another great cooler season annual that you can plant right now and enjoy for the next couple months, because again, while it may not be considered a true perennial to some people, it should come back and it should look really nice, just again, until we have a couple hard freezes. It is very hardy in that way. Snapdragons are another good example of one that can last very far, although I wouldn't suggest starting those seeds now, but if you have any available, still a good one that you can look into and reach out for. So that's going to be annuals. That's going to be, again, some of your veggies here, as well as some of your flowers. If I had any really nice ornamental kale, if I had space on this table, I would absolutely show you the other things I was talking about, but that is a good example there. Now, fall planting is not just constricted to annuals, vegetables, and flowers of that sort. You can also very easily plant some of your fall blooming perennials this time of year. That is going to include things like rudbeckia, helianthemum, which is a really nice one. You also have some of your anemones that are going to be blooming in the fall. What else do we have out there? The soapworts are also blooming right now. Really nice blue flower. Again, if I had more room on this table, I would have brought all this stuff out here for you guys to show you. But it's really important to keep in mind. And going off of this theme, there are perennials that may not be blooming in the fall, but have really good fall color. Geraniums are a really great example, or some of your mock strawberries, another really great example of something that is a perennial, but not necessarily flowering, but have a tremendously impressive fall color. And the idea with planting something that is perennial this time of year is that if it's blooming, more than likely it's putting all of its energy into blooming. And this can be said with annuals in general, or chrysanthemums, but especially in the fall now, we're getting less light and plants are reacting to that change. So they're putting energy into blooms, they're not putting as much energy into roots, which is what I'm going to get to once we start talking about caring for all these plants that we can do in the fall. But just important to know that care is still going to be very important, and it's going to just change a bit once we get into this fall season. Is it a bad time to repot my indoor plants, or should I wait till spring? That is a question I just got here, and it is, while it's not a bad time to replot your indoor plants, it's not the best time. Indoor plants react very similarly to outdoor plants in that they are going to change and react with the seasons. In the spring and summer, it's going to be much easier for that plant to grow, especially if they're near a window. They're getting more light and they are reacting to the increase of of that light. I would always suggest repotting indoor plants probably about February or March, so they get a chance to root in and then can really grow during the summer. But it will also depend on the plant as well. Anything woody, especially at that time. If it's something herbaceous like a Schefflera, a snake plant, something like that, you can really repot those anytime. Just keep in mind that it's not going to need as much water once we start getting into winter. So there is that for you. But back to perennials there. Again, some of them are looking really nice. They will be blooming. Just make sure, just like with that houseplant question, that their water needs are going to change based on the season. So if you are the person that's giving, say, 5 gallons every week or something like that, make sure that you're checking the soil before you do that because it may not need it. So that's a little bit about some of our herbaceous perennials. If you're planting any shrubs and trees right now, you absolutely can. But let's split this up even further. I want to talk a little bit about deciduous shrubs and trees first. Now, deciduous, of course, meaning it has leaves. Oh, it's not really. Leaves and not needles, pine needles. And we'll lose those leaves. Now, deciduous trees, plants that are going to be losing those leaves, have evolved to change with the seasons. They have quite literally evolved with Earth's rotation and expend their energy in a way that is sufficient with those changes. So when you're dealing with something deciduous, you essentially have two groups of deciduous plants. Number one are determinate, and number two is indeterminate growers. This is also used to describe some tomatoes that are determinate or indeterminate. That's more for their life cycle, but I like to categorize deciduous plants in that same way. And what I mean by that, indeterminate growth is going to mean something like a cottonwood, something like a chokecherry, something that is going to be consistently growing throughout the seasons if conditions are met. Meaning that it will always be rooting. If it's always growing, it should always be rooting. And those are much easier to plant really any time of year. And then you have more of your determinate growers, ones that once they do start growing and their conditions are met, they have a certain amount that they will grow. And once they're done with that, they'll harden off that foliage and that stem tissue and essentially wait to go dormant, do it again next year. Now, the indeterminate growers are great to plant now because they're still rooting and you could still do all the same care you would be. And the determinate growers you can still plant now, but it would be helpful if they were given a little assistance to get a little bit of that rooting done before we start reaching our cool season. Now, I'm going to go a little bit more into care about that as well. I want to talk about conifers real quick, and then we'll switch into caring for what you just planted. So we have our plan. We know what we can plant, whether it be an annual, a vegetable, a perennial, a deciduous tree. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about conifers. Here's a conifer I brought up today. As you can see, there are different colors on this conifer. There's lighter green and there's your darker green. This right here is little Serbian spruce. Now conifers, many of them are used to more temperate, rocky, well-draining organic matter conditions. We really don't have much of that, and I'm making a generalization here. It's not all conifers that require those things. Junipers are a great example of one that don't, but the spruce, and the Serbian spruce especially, is a good example of that. Now, conifers are absolutely determinate growers. They are not going to grow more than once per season unless you have perfect conditions like the Pacific Northwest, in which your seasons may blend together and trick conifers into growing more. But in a place with very structured seasons like the Front Range here, where there is a winter, there is a summer, and it's very clear, conifers are only going to push out one season of growth, or one round of growth, I should say. Now, while they will be consistently rooting, they're going to be most of that rooting in the spring, which is why I always suggest people plant some of your conifers, specialty evergreens, in the spring, because it's cooler, it's less of a stressful experience, and you get to allow the whole season to be rooted in. Now, again, it's not something that is set in stone. You can plant conifers whenever you'd like. In fact, I had a customer last winter come in and grab 5 spreading junipers, plant them in the middle of winter, and they're all doing great now. So while it is easier for care to plant conifers in the spring, it is not absolutely necessary. Again, as long as that watering is consistent and agreeable with whatever plant that you chose, meaning you're letting it dry out a bit in between those waterings. Now this one that I just pulled up, I will show you again here, is pushing out new growth right now, which is very odd and very out of season for something like this. This may be a product of the fact that it is a dwarf and therefore is stunted. Its metabolism is not as rampant, I should say, and is not going to really push out a lot of prolific growth. It's going to be very slow. But most of your conifers, spruce, pines, junipers, have already pushed out their new growth, and now it's starting to harden off, and they're setting bud for next season, which is great. That's awesome. And that is exactly why I suggest to do a lot of that rooting and growing in the spring. That's why you plant in the spring for those. But it can be done if conditions are met. So, let us talk a little bit about care for these things, because it is very important to know how to care for all this stuff once it's in the ground. I keep talking about water, I keep pushing that, and it's just because that is extremely important, especially that winter water is going to be really, really important for planting. So, say that we decided to start some seeds right now. Fantastic. You know what? Throw a little bit more compost into your garden bed. If you're reusing one from an earlier cool season crop, refertilize, re-amend. That's awesome. And once those seeds start, you can start doing some good fertilizing to get those back in. You can use some of your organic fertilizers. Espoma products are really nice that you can incorporate into the soil. There are liquids like a root stimulator, or there are Fox Farm products, which I'm a big fan of, that are great for vegetable beds. But it's very important to kind of know that when you plant your cool season crops, unless you want them to be small and you don't really need a whole lot from them, you still need to treat them like you would in the spring by amending them and giving them water and fertilizer like anybody else would, especially because the seasons are changing, we're getting less light, and they won't grow necessarily as vigorously as they once did. If you're planting annuals, same deal. Get some nice potting mix, give them some good fertilizer, consistent water. That's all going to be important. Once you start going into more of your perennial plants, like this wonderful little rutabaga here, it is important, just like I keep mentioning, to allow them to dry out in between waterings. However, that is something I would suggest no matter how you plant, whether it be directly into clay, whether it be mixed in with compost. You still want to let them dry out a little bit in between waterings. Again, their metabolism is not going to be what it was in the height of summer. So, going back to the planting itself, like I said, if you're planting seeds or vegetables, flowers, and you are putting them in the same bed, re-amend, re-fertilize, make sure they're getting some good love there. If you start planting perennials, trees, shrubs, then it's going to be important that you amend the soil. And that is something that we always suggest for any customer that comes out of here, is that you are using compost and root stimulator. Now, compost is going to be extremely important. Cotton burr compost is what we have here. It is a plant-based compost, meaning it has no manure, and therefore it does not have an excess of salts, which could eventually burn the new roots that you're trying to encourage. And root stimulator, right here. Big old thing of root stim. This is a fantastic product. It has a compound called IVA auxin as the active ingredient, which is a naturally occurring plant hormone, and it is formed in the leaves and will be sent down to the roots and used in other aspects of the plant for various things, but it essentially tells roots to start branching. If you ever took a cutting, dipped it in a powder, put it in soil, you dipped it in a powdered version of IVA auxin, which again tells tissue to start rooting and tells roots to start branching, So, if you are planting in the fall, you have a poor location, you have everything set up, it's important that you are amending the soil, allowing some organic matter to get into the soil, which is very lacking in our alkaline clay, and you are also encouraging some rooting, especially this time of year, before we get those hard freezes. Now, it's important that things are wet when we have those hard freezes, because if things dry and they're frozen, they will desiccate and die off. If they're wet and frozen, then they'll be happy, they'll do just fine, and they will be all prepared for winter, which is again why root stimulator is going to be very important to amend with the soil during fall plantings. Now, if you do not have access to water, if you don't have access to drip, it is also important to know that you can mulch your plants. That is very helpful. And if you aren't the person that wants to go out there and water every week, then it's a way to increase the self-sufficiency of your plants. And I brought some with me here. This is what we have. This is a nice big bag of mulch of some cedar chips. And the cedar chips are really nice because, number one, they're not dyed. It's more of an all-natural chip. And once you put a couple layer inches, 3, 4, on top of your new planting, it'll help, number one, cool down the plant, it cools it much better than rockwood, which acts as almost like a convection oven underneath the soil. It also helps retain water. So if you're planting something right now, you amend the soil, you water it with root stimulator when you do water, and you mulch it, you can get away for a pretty decent period of time without giving supplemental water due to the moisture retention of your mulch. Now, that's just the mulch that I have here at the nursery. It works great, but any mulch will do as long as it's not really rubber or rock in general. Any wood mulch is fantastic. Again, retains water and also cools down the plant a bit, allows it to keep that moisture for longer, nice and even, and eventually will help encourage the rooting, mixed in with those other things. This is the same thing I would do for your shrubs, your trees, your evergreens. Regardless of what it is, compost, root stimulator, and mulch are the best way to plan for your planting and to keep things wet into winter, especially once we turn off that irrigation, we get it out of our minds, and those things are still going to need moisture because, again, a dry, frozen plant is going to desiccate and be much sadder than a wet frozen plant, which is going to be very happy, insulated, and as the water freezes, produces heat via that exothermic process. So, again, planning to plant is all about, number one, your location, from everything from the amount of sun you're getting, access to water, planning for eventual sizes, and the soil that's in the area. And it's important to know that you can plant some more of those veggies, cool season annuals like pansies, your lettucey, harvest and repeat crops like lettuce, kale, spinach, even, like I said, some broccoli sometimes if you want to test your luck. And it's just, again, important to know how you're going to care for it later on. A lot of people, like I said, get it out of their head that once I turn off my sprinklers, everything's good. And that's when most things die, especially in that month of November when we're transitioning from these hot days to cool nights and those hard freezes. But it's also important to know about the life cycle of the plant and what you're planting. Again, conifers, determinate growing plants, are only going to push out a certain amount of growth per year, while as indeterminate plants, or more your herbaceous plants, are going to be rooting more consistently until they cannot. So I feel like I've pretty much went over what I kind of wanted to say about a lot of this stuff. Since this class was more about the planning overall and the care once you have planted, I didn't want to delve too much into specifics. Just a bit about those determinate versus indeterminate growers, woody plants versus herbaceous plants, annuals versus perennials. So I think that I'm probably going to end the class up here unless there is any questions whatsoever. I'm more than happy to answer them. But I appreciate everybody that does come by. Again, fall is still a good time to plant. It's cooler. Things won't be rooting as much, but you absolutely can do it. Just make sure they're wet before those hard freezes. Make sure you're knowing your space, you're knowing your conditions, knowing your access to water. Make sure that you are amending, watering with some root stimulator, letting things dry out, mulching, and then, of course, allowing them to stay wet before we have hard freezes, which will be coming up here and closer than we know it. So, without any more questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Again, thank you, everybody, for joining up, and see you next time.